Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Medical Device Risk Analysis. In today's webinar, Ms. Bernstein will discuss why you need to know about risk in medical devices, clinical data and devices, adverse events handling, identifying hazards, assigning risk values simple to very complex, and how manufacturers manage risk. To give you a little background about our presenter, Christina Bernstein, she has a master's degree in medical device and diagnostic engineering from the University of Southern California. She manufactures an FDA-cleared Class II medical device accessory in the USA. She is a regulatory consultant to USA manufacturers of cancer care devices. Ms. Bernstein was formerly employed by a large publicly traded Class III medical device manufacturer. She has more than 10 years of work experience in medical and non-medical industries. For those of our attendees who require a passcode, the word for today is risk. During the Q&A session, we will ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. Thank you all again for attending today, and Christina, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, and hi, everybody. I'm going to go through this presentation. I have organized it into the first half where we're actually going to be talking about some cases that they're in the news. They're relevant to anybody that's either a plaintiff's attorney or representing a defendant that would be a medical device manufacturer. And also, I've tried to include a lot of illustrations and kind of give you a general idea of what's going on with these cases today. And then toward the latter half of the presentation, I have a little bit more of an analysis of how medical device risk is identified and measured. And we do also have a space in the middle for questions and also at the end. So I will try to make my comments very succinct and also go back and show some of the pictures and kind of talk about why you want to be looking at risk in devices. The reason is that the concept of risk is a little bit different with medical devices as opposed to if you thought about risk in the financial markets or risk in, maybe a psychological sense, someone being like a, risk taker or risk adverse. But one of the reasons that it's so important to understand this stuff is that most medical devices that are out on the market in the United States, they're cleared by the FDA and they're not approved. And the difference is that there's no human trials, there's no clinical data in a lot of these devices. They've been produced by the manufacturer, and the manufacturer has internally tried to understand what risk there is associated with putting the device out on the market. And as we can see, it's pretty complicated, and also the problems that have come out with some of these cases, they're it's very interesting to think of them within a risk viewpoint. So who's affected by risk in a medical device? Well, if you're looking at this picture, you'd say this young lady, she's getting an ultrasound exam, and you would say, well, definitely she's affected by any, risk, whether it would be like a bad image or a false diagnosis. But if you really think about it the way that people like me think about risk, there's a whole chain of events and a whole chain of people that are affected by it. If you look at there's a hand in the right-hand side of the picture. It looks like a man's hand, but holding a probe, and that's the ultrasound probe. Well, that person who's operating the probe may have to do that motion many hundreds of times, even thousands of times over the course of their career. So there could be a risk to that person if the probe was designed in a way that they would get, say, repetitive motion injuries, or if they were unable to grasp it effectively, it could hurt them. Also, if they were unable to grasp that probe effectively, it could affect the operation or getting the image. There's a person standing here by the patient. It looks like a nurse or an assistant, and she's got a wipe. Well, she's going to wipe the patient off, but what is she using to wipe the patient off? And I mean, I know this is very detailed, but this is exactly the type of scenario that medical device manufacturers use to internally identify what problems could be in their device when it's actually used on patients. Because, as I'd mentioned previously, the vast majority of devices that are out on the market don't have human trials data associated with them. And we will go into some of that in further slides as well. Another possible risk here is that this ultrasound machine is an electrical device. It's plugged into the hospital electrical mains. So a manufacturer would also want to know, is there any problem with, electricity leakage? It has to be insulated. It has to be safe to use. It has to be with a standard connector. And the reason I'm going into this level of detail is what we'll talk about later is if you were looking at internal documents that a manufacturer would have if you have a lawsuit. So speaking of lawsuits, there are some cases that are actually in the general news every day now. I mean, I read the LA Times every morning, and almost every single week there's an update. There's a terrible problem. It's actually throughout the country. From what I understand, a lot of you are calling in from all different parts of the United States, and you may be aware of this depending on where you live. There have been cases. These are just some general articles. If you look for it on a web search in the news, lots and lots of articles are going to pop up now. But what the problem is that there's a company that makes a device. I'm going to skip ahead here to give you a picture of it. There's a device called a duodenoscope, and it goes into the patient. It's actually going through the mouth, and you can see it goes in to treat problems that have to do with the liver or the pancreas. And I'm going to go back now to talking about what the problems are. The problem is that patients, unfortunately, it's a ghastly problem. They're getting infected by a bug called CRE. It's a bacteria that has resisted all known drugs to treat it. And it's up to a 50% death rate in these patients. So, I mean, this is really, really awful. And one of the reasons that I actually started reading the articles recently was, as a total coincidence, my company is involved in getting FDA clearance for an enzymatic cleaner that's used for these types of products. And I, in fact, got retained to be an expert on a case. And I've been looking into what has been going on. I don't have currently any special insight. I'm just reading the news, just like everyone else is. But one of the big problems is the way these devices are designed. There's a lawsuit that just got filed, and the lawsuit alleges that the company that makes this endoscope redesigned it, and when they did the redesign, they did not revisit their cleaning protocols. So there are these crevices. I mean, these are tiny, tiny, micron, millimeter-sized crevices where these bugs can hide. And apparently, the standard protocols that they had used, that they had developed to clean these devices are not working. And so these bugs are not getting killed. And these products are reused between patients. And the patients, unfortunately, are getting infected with this CRE. So as I said, I don't have any special insight into this case because I haven't seen any internal documents, and even if I had, I probably wouldn't be able to talk about them. So everything I'm telling you is just things that have been in the news, or my husband, who's an attorney, actually helped me look up some of these lawsuits. And so a recent one that was filed in Los Angeles Superior Court alleges that there was this design change and the company did not go through the proper cleaning protocols, or they didn't verify the cleaning protocols. And the reason that this is such a problem is that there's a financial aspect to it for the hospital. The hospital has to send the product out to be cleaned in a different manner. What hospitals typically do is clean the scope. Here, I'm going to go back to this slide here. These little bugs that would hide in crevices and stuff, what you would normally do is use an enzymatic chemical bath and basically scrub the endoscope and soak it for a while, and then you would be able to say, okay, it's sterilized, you can use it on the next patient. Well, because it appears that that particular approach is not adequate, the hospital now will send the product out to a reprocessor, which is a specialty kind of a service company, and they use gas sterilization to clean these duodenoscopes. And the hospital has ended up buying double the number of these devices. So, for instance, UCLA Hospital, where this particular lawsuit was filed against UCLA Hospital and the manufacturer of the device, they say they had 5 of these duodenoscopes and they would clean them and then reuse them between patients. Well, they've actually went out and bought another 5 because they're having to send these things out and wait a day or two for them to come back to the hospital. So they've even spent more money with the manufacturer, which is very interesting. So it's one of those things that it's evolving. It's not an open and shut kind of a thing because these problems are just coming to light. And another thing that I'm very interested in looking in with this is that according to the lawsuit that I read, and also according to some general news articles I've read, the manufacturer was even aware of these types of outbreaks in Europe several years ago, and they didn't properly report them to the European regulators, and they also didn't really review what was going on internally. So it's like I said, it's an ongoing kind of a case. In fact, last week, the FDA convened a panel, and a lot of doctors went from hospitals that were affected. A lot of people that are microbiology and infectious disease, nosocomial infection specialists, they went. And the company that makes this product, Olympus, they sent representatives, but they didn't speak there. And so the reason I'm kind of going through this case is because you're going to see a lot more of it in the news. There were outbreaks that were in Seattle. Apparently there were outbreaks in New York. There's this outbreak in Los Angeles at 2 hospitals. And I even read an article from CNN that said that the problem has been with these bugs has even been known in nursing homes for several years. But one of the issues is that the FDA does not require healthcare facilities to report outbreaks of that particular bug, the CRE. It looks like that's going to change now. Anyway, going back to what does that mean about risk? Well, if I'm just reading the popular media, articles in CNN and the LA Times, the probability seems like it would be really high, and the severity would be, catastrophic. And the reason that it's important to kind of know these terms is that if you are an attorney and you have a client that's a plaintiff, or if you're representing the manufacturer, the defendant in some of these lawsuits, you have to go through and look at internal documents that are part of the risk assessment and risk management for the device. And depending on the device, it can be really complicated, long, many pages of documentations, some simpler devices that can be shorter, but you'll have to know what to look for. And then probably what some of you are saying to yourselves right now is like, oh my gosh, well, how did this happen? Isn't there clinical data? Didn't this get tested in humans? Well, as I had said earlier, most devices that are on the market do not have clinical data because there's no requirement to have clinical trials. It's not like a drug. Companies that develop new drugs, they have to do clinical trials in humans and they report their results, and then the FDA approves the drug. But with class 2 devices, that's the majority of devices that are out on the market, they don't have this human data requirement. And what manufacturers do in actual fact is they will have test data. You can use animal testing. There's a lot of really well-known protocols to make sure that there's no sensitivity or that there's biocompatibility and safety. And that's used both with test tubes and also on animals. There's also a lot of protocols where you can test physical properties of devices. You know, how hot or cold can it get? How well does it stand up to this chemical cleaning? You know, electromagnetic testing, just even mechanical properties like stress testing. These are all things that you would want to look for in the documentation, because the manufacturers of these products, it's you know, Olympus is a huge company, and it's not as though they haven't done any risk analysis. It's just that if you look at, you know, if you get to the point where you look at any of their internal documents, I'm sure there's going to be pages and pages in there where they've done electrochemical testing, where they've done physical strength of materials testing, where they've even tested, you know, the lawsuit alleges that they had tested the cleaning protocols, but they just didn't update them when the design changes. So the best you can do is just assume that you're not going to have any human clinical data, but go through and look at what test was performed for the device before it got put out on the market. And then if there were changes in the devices, you know, did the manufacturer also test to make sure that those changes were minimizing risk to patients? And there is an application called a 510K, which manufacturers use to get their devices cleared by the FDA. Unfortunately, 510Ks, you can see a summary statement online. That's public information. But if you ask for a full 510K from the FDA, a lot of times it's really slow to get them, and they'll have a lot of redacted information. If you're working for a manufacturer, you know, if you're an attorney for a manufacturer, then definitely ask to see the 510K application and clearance for the device, because it will have extensive reports in there, you know, on any kind of physical or chemical or biological testing they did do for the device. And as I just said, you know, so if there's no clinical data and, you know, you're saying to yourself, well, how do these people get the product out on the market? Well, you know, as I just talked about, there are really extensive internal documents for most devices where groups of safety engineers, design engineers, anyone who's involved in the production of the device, they'll get together and kind of brainstorm and try to define what the risk is. There are also international standards that are used, and these guidance documents are very well known to anyone who's in the medical device design business. And so I am going to go on to some further slides that talk about the actual definitions here, but there's the basic idea with risk as opposed as opposed to any kind of risk in financial markets or, in psychology or something. Risk with medical devices is actually a number, and it's a combination of a probability, like how likely is it to occur, and then what are the consequences. So I will show you further on, we do have some examples of risk matrices or risk tables, and when you review documents, you will likely see these things. And the reason that it's also very important to really get a good understanding of this is because there's no given way to measure the risk for every single device. It's up to the manufacturer. And when you have manufacturers that compete, where they have devices that are very similar, those manufacturers may actually have different ways of measuring risk for the very same type of device or the very same situation. And I will also go into that. I just was on a case where we had exactly that happen, where there were two manufacturers of a product and they had completely different ideas about the risk for a certain situation. So here's another case that I wanted to bring up. This is something that occurred a few years ago, and this again is just an excerpt from, I think, it looks like it's from Bloomberg Business, but there's a lot of popular media if you search for this. But there's a really well-known medical device company called Stryker. They're huge. They are a company that makes orthopedic medical devices. They make hospital beds. I mean, they're a conglomerate. And they actually were involved in a criminal case. The U.S. Attorney's Office brought a case against them several years ago, and they ended up pleading guilty. And I'm going to go through this case. I did not have any specific involvement in it, but I remember reading about it, and then, from understanding what happened with risk and also understanding how this could have occurred, it's a very educational experience to go through what happened with them. And again, I feel as though if we look at some actual cases, it's more relevant. And then I'll go back and kind of get into some details on how risk is estimated and measured and maybe mitigated or transferred, different things that you can do with risk. But we'll go back and look at some of these cases just to make sure that you have an understanding of the abstract concepts and how they're actually applied in these real-world cases. Oh, so at this point, do we have any questions?
And before we begin the question and answer segment, could all the attendees type the passcode into the Q&A? Okay, our first question is, how long is the duodenoscope inside the patient?
Oh, that's a very good question. The answer is I don't exactly know because I am not a clinician, but a duodenoscope is it can be a diagnostic or therapeutic procedure. So it could be inside somebody for, I want to say it could even be inside somebody for more than an hour or two, but it's not something that's going to be inside somebody for days and days. It's just a procedure, and depending on what the clinician wants to do, it could just be a few minutes if they just want to take a sample to biopsy, or if they want to do a therapeutic treatment. The duodenoscope is designed so that different instruments can go down to in the tube, and it can treat bile ducts, which are things that drain out of your liver, or it can also treat parts of the pancreas, like the pancreatic ducts. And again, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know the exact length of time, but it can be in there for a while.
Okay, and is it easier to get products sold in Europe, and are the patients there exposed to new products first?
Yeah, currently the way the regulatory environment is, most companies will get their products approved for sale. And I'm saying approved now. The European Union has a different set of wording. So if you have a product here that has to go through this FDA process and get cleared for marketing in the European market, they'll say that you've been granted a CE mark, which is the European Union's way of saying that you can sell the product throughout the European Union. And it is currently easier and costs less money to have the product sold in Europe first. And generally, the reason also is that it also gives manufacturers a chance to get this kind of clinical experience, like what actually happens when you use it in humans. However, that said, the European community, they've also had some problems. There's a lot more self-regulation in Europe, and there were a couple of really well-publicized cases. There was one with some breast implants, a company called PIP, and PIP used industrial silicone in their implants. They didn't use medical-grade silicone. They used industrial silicone, and it also occurred that some of the sacs in the breast implants were also not really tested for durability. So some of them leaked, and because the industrial silicone contains impurities, there were women that were implanted with these things that just had terrible problems, terrible health problems. And because of this PIP scandal, the European Union actually has gone, they have a working committee, and the regulations in Europe will actually be changing soon, and they're becoming more like what we do here in the United States. They're going to require more data, and for these types of permanent implants, they may go to the same type of model as the FDA has, where you have to do some clinical trials. And that's specifically because of that PIP. The company was called, I forgot what the company was called, but their implant was called the PIP implant, and it was really in the news about 2 years ago. So the answer is currently, I'm sorry to give such a long answer, but currently it is easier and less money to get your products sold in Europe. But it's going to change soon.
Okay, our next question is, has the FDA provided guidelines to medical device companies? If so, are these changing given CRE outbreaks?
So it's a specific question for this CRE outbreak. The FDA convened a panel, it was about a week or 10 days ago, because it looks like they're going to have to issue some guidelines. There are current guidelines on reprocessing instruments. That's what this whole thing is called. If you have a reusable device and you need to clean it and sterilize it for the next patient, it's called reprocessing it. So there are some guidelines on reprocessing. They're very general because they're not just talking about duodenoscopes. They're talking about any kind of device, whether it's a clamp or a scalpel, or even there's even covers that go onto mattresses and beds that patients go into like an MRI machine with. So these guidelines are just so general. So there's more than likely going to be some specific guidance from FDA because of the publicity that these cases have.
Okay, and do you also consider in your practice combined risk for patient based on risk profile of the device and indication, for example, essential procedure versus elective or even off-label use?
Oh, that's a great question. So it turns out that the cases where I've worked as an expert witness, the manufacturer, their defense is always, well, we gave indications for use and instructions for proper use of the device, but in fact, the user, the clinician or the hospital or whoever was using the device that caused a problem, they didn't follow our instructions for use, or they may have used it off-label. And that is really the crux of most of these lawsuits that I've seen. So that's a very, very good question, and I personally have personal opinions, expert opinions, that there are international standards documents. There's another standards document which is from there's another organization called Amy Anstey, but it's called Human Factors, and basically just to boil it down to its essence, it's this big long document. It basically says that you have to assume that people will use things incorrectly and they will use things off-label, and you have to make allowances for that as a manufacturer. So it's very contentious. I mean, it's definitely something that I've seen in every single one of these lawsuits, where the manufacturer will say, you didn't follow directions, you did use it off-label, that's your liability, and then the plaintiff or the plaintiff's attorney will say, well, but Mr. Manufacturer, Ms. Manufacturer, you have to allow for the fact that people make mistakes, or that people will do things off-label. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this case with Stryker. That's a very good example of things being used completely off-label.
Okay, those are all the questions we have, so please continue with the presentation.
Oh, okay. So that last question was actually a terrific way to go to this rest of this. This really was I was quite shocked when I read through all of this. So what happened was this company, Stryker Biotech, that was a subsidiary of Stryker. And one thing that I should say, if you're not familiar with a lot of ways these medical device companies operate, because I worked for a big one. I used to work for Medtronic, and I also work with small companies that are bringing new devices to market. And in the United States, what's the most common way to get a smaller company grown is the company will come out with a product or a service, and one of their exit strategies is they want to be acquired by these larger companies. So back in the day when, say, Stryker started out, or Zimmer or Medtronic, the companies kind of grew organically. They had their own R&D, and they would invent new products, and they just sort of grew that way. But now, really, I would say for the last 15, 20 years, what companies like Medtronic or Stryker, these big companies with a lot of money, they acquire smaller companies. And the reason for that is partially the risk. They know that these smaller companies are taking on the risk of a new type of product, and also the R&D spending keeps getting cut at a lot of the bigger companies. So the reason I'm bringing all this up is that it turns out it's very relevant to what happened in this case. And what happened was Stryker acquired a company, and it was called Stryker. They ended up calling it Stryker Biotech. And Stryker Biotech made, I'm just going to show you some of these products they made. So Stryker Biotech made this one product that was called Calstrux. And what Calstrux does or did was it fills voids in bones. And what's a void in a bone? If a person has a fractured vertebrae and part of the bone chips off, or say an orthopedic surgeon has to drill a hole in order to put pins or a screw into the bone. Well, the screw's supposed to fit pretty well into the hole, but the screw's threaded, so even if it's a threaded hole, it might not be perfect fit. And so this Calstrux product is something that was used to fill voids in bones. And everything that I've seen, I've looked at, there's a lot of public data that you can look at like warning letters or inspection reports, things like that the FDA does. As far as I know, this particular product was fine. I mean, it had been on sale in the U.S., and the facility that manufactured it was a perfectly good facility. Stryker had another product. Like I said, I'm just going to skip around here just to make it easier to understand. And it was called OP1 putty and OP1 implant. And again, this product, from everything I understand, was okay. I mean, it was manufactured in a state-of-the-art plant. And what this product did was, it's a bone growth stimulator. It causes they're called osteoblasts, but they're like bone cells. It causes them to grow faster. And so these two separate products were completely fine as far as I know. So what was the problem? Well, what happened was, in 2009, the United States Attorney General actually filed a criminal case against Stryker Biotech, and they named 4 individuals, and one was the president of Stryker Biotech, and 3 were sales managers. And what the lawsuit alleged, and Stryker did end up pleading guilty to this, was that Stryker Biotech promoted a combination of those 2 products. And the problem was that that combination had never been tested, not even in a test tube, nothing. What happened was the sales reps, it's in case you guys didn't know, it's very common for sales reps, especially in cardiovascular and orthopedic surgeries. Sales reps go into the operating room, and they're supposed to be the manufacturer's device experts and give guidance to the clinicians during the operation. And in fact, I used to work as an OR sales rep, and I'm a biomedical engineer, and I'm also somebody who's very proud of my knowledge. And I would say the majority of operating room sales reps are pretty good people. They have varying backgrounds, but they mean most of them are very good people, and they really care about doing a good job. So, but in this case, what happened was the combinations of these 2 products, they were never tested, and the clinicians, the orthopedic surgeons, just during the operation, under the guidance of the sales reps, they were mixing these 2 products together. And the idea was, it was because one of the products, apparently some of the doctors used to complain, well, it's really hard to put the stuff into the void. It's really tough to get it in there because it's sort of like grains of sand, or it's like wet sand. It's really tough to manipulate. And so the idea was that if they mixed it with this putty, it would almost be like silly putty, and you could just put it right into wherever you wanted to put it, and it would just stay there. That was the idea. Well, the product was never tested that way, and it was what ended up happening was there were a lot of complications. And so there were patients that were implanted with this combination, and they ended up having bone growth, too much bone growth. Can you imagine, like, you would go in as a patient to have your vertebrae repaired, and instead of just repairing the vertebrae, extra bone spurs started to grow, and it could be extremely painful and, dangerous. The other problem was, apparently the combination of these products, there was no set protocol or recipe on how to do this, and sometimes it was mixed with saline, sometimes it was mixed with the patient's blood. It was just all done on the fly in the operating room. And the problem, this was actually an internal document that the lawsuit quoted. There was a sales meeting at Stryker Biotech, and there was a vice president saying, hey, potentially a very severe problem, because what could happen? Well, there could be a product recall. The FDA could come in and shut us down. We could be criminally prosecuted, and individual executives could have criminal fines and penalties. Well, that's exactly what happened. The government went in, and it was a criminal prosecution. They named these 4 individuals, and it was all because there was absolutely no way to, how would you even assign risk to something like this? You can't really even estimate the probability of something happening because it's never even been tested. Nobody at the company ever sat down to even talk about the risk. So it was a really, this is a really extreme example, and it was just a terrible situation. So what ended up happening was, I'm going to go back to the lawsuit here. What ended up happening was that, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong slide. What ended up happening was I apologize. I'm sorry. I am on a different set of slides here. What ended up happening with Stryker was, I'm sorry, I'm thinking that I'm going to a certain slide and it's going to a different slide. So let me just
Which slide are you looking for, Tina?
Well, I'm clicking on ones that are talking about the Stryker case. Okay, now I got it back. Apparently my screen and my strip up above were out of sync for a minute. So I apologize to everybody for the confusing set of slides there. Anyway, what ended up happening with Stryker was the company did plead guilty, and in return for a guilty plea, and they paid a $15 million fine, and in return the government dropped the criminal charges against the individuals. But what's actually happened with the company is that Stryker Biotech no longer exists. And then let me go back to this very interesting thing here. If you notice, this product actually says Olympus on it. So what happened was that Stryker Biotech went out of business, and then they sold this product to Olympus America, which is the very same company that's in the news right now with the Endoscope problem. So you could say in this case that Stryker transferred the risk. They transferred the risk to Olympus. And what ended up happening, I've read in some newspaper articles, unfortunately, the company Olympus, they bought the plant, the physical plant that makes this product, and it was like a state-of-the-art factory. It was up in New Hampshire. Apparently, it was $100 million worth of equipment in there, and they employed almost 200 people. And all of those people got laid off, and these were fairly well-paid jobs. They were good jobs, especially up in New Hampshire. And now I believe the factory was bought by another medical company, which is going to make a completely different product there. But this product, I don't even think it's on the market anymore, just because of all of the liability from these lawsuits. But what's really sad is this product on its own, I don't think was a bad product. And just because of these 4 people, hundreds of millions of dollars lost, jobs lost. A product that actually looks like a reasonable product is no longer, really on the market anymore. So these are the consequences of not estimating risk, and it's really it was really a sad thing. So as I had mentioned before, with risk, it's kind of an educated guess, because all of these manufacturers, they have to do it. They kind of bring it on themselves to do it. One thing is with the FDA, it's the Food and Drug Administration, and the FDA is extremely preoccupied with food safety. So when it comes to medical device safety, as I had mentioned, there are these quality system regulations, there's international guidelines, but it's really up to the manufacturer themselves to estimate risk and decide what to do about it. And we're going to go through a few slides now where I talk about, I'm just going to show you what some of the standards definitions are. And this, again, is very important because if you're looking through internal manufacturer documents, you need to understand the wording and how manufacturers are attempting to address, potential problems. So a hazard is, let me just give you examples of hazards. A hazard could be, as we had seen in our picture, my very first picture. Actually, let's go to this one. A hazard could be, as you can see this duodenoscope, it goes through the patient's mouth and it goes all the way through the duodenum, which is part of your digestive system. That's why it's called a duodenoscope. It can go, like I said, they can do some biopsies or they can do some therapeutic treatment for the liver or the pancreas. Well, a hazard could be, it could go down the wrong airway. We have two airways. We have one that goes into our lungs and one that goes into our digestive systems. And also it could, cause some damage to the teeth or the tongue. It could cause damage, just going through your duodenum. There's all kinds of things that could happen. So a manufacturer will identify the risks, identify hazards as, well, we have to make sure that the materials used are really flexible and soft and they won't damage any of the soft tissue that's in the, inside the body. And if you look at any documents, for these types of devices, they definitely will have those types of discussions. And what they try to do as a manufacturer is make a risk table. And here's a very simple risk table. Sometimes it's called a risk matrix. And what we do at my company is I like to use very simple types of tables. And I don't like to use a lot of numbers because it's kind of like a times table. See, there's 9 combinations because there's 3 rows and 3 columns. But in this case, this is a very simple kind of a risk matrix because it's basically color-coded. And actually, I think this is a great example. There are some more complicated ones. I'm going to show you a more complicated one here. And this one actually has numbers assigned to it. And you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, what are these people doing? Well, it's because I actually just reviewed documents on a case that had to do with a pretty complicated kind of a device that was called a fetal heart rate monitor. That's something that monitors the baby's heart rate during labor. And the company that made that device basically decided that any risk had to be modified or mitigated down to below a certain level. Because if it was above a certain level, it was considered too high of a risk. And what the lawsuit actually was about was that the manufacturer said, no, we estimated the risk and we got the risk down to an acceptable level. But what the plaintiff alleged was that, no, in fact, you didn't estimate the risk properly, and it was still at way too high of a level, and that's why this terrible problem occurred. So when you look at the documents, again, like I said, you will need to at least get a basic understanding of what these kinds of risk matrices or risk tables are all about and why there's certain numbers on them. And also, there's another type of calculation that manufacturers can make, and that's, what's the probability of this hazard occurring? Well, instead of just guessing, if you already have a lot of devices out on the market, you can use actual empirical data to estimate a probability. And I'm just giving you a really simple example, but what's important to realize here is like I said, I actually made this example up. This isn't based on any real actual device documents that I saw. But what is really important to remember is, just to give you an example, say there's 2,000 of these devices and they're used 2 times each day. Well, that means they're used 4,000 times a day. And if you had 10 adverse events, the occurrence rate would be 0.25% or 1/4%. Well, you could say to yourself, okay, that's really low, but if you actually multiply that by 365 days, you're like, oh, you know what? There could be several occurrences of this problem. And so this is the type of stuff that I've actually seen in some of the cases I've worked on where the manufacturer will say, oh, but look, it's such a low occurrence rate. And then the plaintiff or the person harmed will say, well, but no, look, it's actually happened so many times because you have so many of these units installed. And again, risk is a quantitative measurement with medical devices. There has to be an actual number that's assigned, but the level of severity is kind of qualitative, and these particular levels are actually taken straight from the International Standards document on risk, and so you'll often see this type of wording in the risk file for a device, or the device history file. That's another document that's very important to look at when you're reviewing, potential problems with a medical device. So typically what manufacturers will do is they'll say, well, if something's minor or negligible and it's got a low probability of occurrence, then, we'll give it we'll assign it 0.2. But if it's catastrophic, we'll give it we'll assign a really high number. And also if it's a high probability of occurrence, it's a really high number. And in fact, that's too high. We have to do something to mitigate that risk. We either don't sell the product or we have to modify the product. So how does a manufacturer reduce risk? Well, there's mitigating the risk, which I just talked about a little bit, where you can modify the device. You could actually choose not to produce the device. That would be avoiding the risk. And transferring the risk is what we just saw with, go back to the a great example. Transferring the risk is very interesting because this was actually transferred from Stryker to Olympus. But then Olympus decided to not even produce the product, and so, in fact, it's avoided the risk altogether. The risk does not exist anymore because the product is no longer out there. And again, this is stuff that's very individual. I've worked on one case recently where I mentioned these fetal monitors, and there's two major companies that make them. And one is GE and one is Philips. And what's very interesting is that one of the companies, they identified there's a hazardous situation where if a baby's heart rate is becoming weak during the last part of labor, the mom's pushing the baby out, and if babies are having a problem, their heart rate can drop. And a mom's heart rate typically is going up, especially during the latter part of labor, the last stage of labor. So for anybody that's not aware, babies generally, babies and children, they have really high heart rates. That's normal. Their resting heart rate can be really high. And, but as adults, we have a lower resting heart rate. Well, if there's a problem, these fetal heart rate monitors, sometimes they've had problems where if the baby's in distress and its heart rate is dropping, the mom's kind of in distress because it's this last stage of labor. The heart rates can be very similar because the mother's heart rate is going up and the baby's heart rate is going down, and they can actually overlap, and it's called heart rate coincidence, where basically it's the same rate, and the machine may have a problem distinguishing which is the mother and which is the baby. So one of the companies thought that was a very potentially hazardous situation, and they sent out a warning letter to doctors and medical facilities, and also they ended up modifying the device once they realized this problem was out there. Another one of the companies, they actually said, well, it's more like it's not really like a catastrophic hazard, it's a feature. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make the display on the device look different to show that there's this heart rate coincidence. And so even though it's the same type of device and it's used for the same situation, which is to monitor the heart rate of the baby during birth, the two manufacturers had two different approaches to identifying the risk and even mitigating the risk. And you will see that almost any kind of medical device that's out on the market is out there because there's a market for it, which means it has competitors. And if you go through and review documents where they talk about the hazards, identified hazards, and how to manage the risks of devices, you'll look at the competing device, and it may be a very different approach. And that's why you really need to have an understanding of how manufacturers look at risk and identify it and potentially mitigate it or avoid it. And as I said, some of these current cases, these duodenoscopes, it's actually out in the news every day now, and I don't know what's going to happen. It's really interesting to see, and and it's also important to remember it's really sad. I mean, it's something that is affecting many more people than the patient. I mean, their families, and it hopefully will result in a safer product down the road. But right now it's as I said, it's an ongoing case. It's an ongoing situation. So oh gosh, we've almost come to the end. Are there any further questions? And by the way, thank you very much, everybody. I know that I kind of jumped around a little bit, but I wanted to make it relevant, and I wanted to make it a little bit easier to understand.
Okay, and could all the attendees please type the passcode into the Q&A once again? Our first question is, how do you know the denominator, or how many devices were sold in a certain area? Regulators get this number in traceability reports, but companies tend to be very careful not to disclose that to the general public.
Oh, I'm not 100% sure if I agree with that statement. I don't have a personal experience where I was unable to find out how many products have been sold, because the thing is, a lot of these bigger medical device companies are publicly traded, and so they release sales numbers. Another way that you can possibly find out some information is there's a lot of public data that's available through the FDA's website, and there are adverse event reports that are available. There's a database called MAUDE, and that just lists adverse events. But another way that you can find out installed devices is actually reviewing manufacturers' risk files, because, as I said, once the product's been out there, most of the complaint investigations that a manufacturer would undertake, one of the first things they look at is how many of these devices are out there and what is the rate of adverse event occurrences.
Okay, the next question is, how long does it take to go through manufacturers' documents on risk?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I worked on this fetal heart rate monitor case, and I was told by the attorney that he had 70,000 pages of documentation to go through. I did not personally look at 70,000 pages. I probably looked at close to 1,000 pages worth of documentation, and it was all related to risk files and device history and some adverse event investigations, complaint investigations. That's a definitely more complicated type of product. If you do have one of those products that has clinical data, those are typically permanent implants like pacemakers or hip implants, things like that. There may be many, many thousands of pages of documentation that relates to the clinical trials and that kind of data. Typically, though, if you really drill down and look at a company's risk file, typically the standard operating procedures, most companies try to actually make those very succinct because an SOP and some of the supporting documents for a standard operating procedure, they're really meant to be used by many people within the company. And we actually have a rule at my company where things like an SOP, they can be no longer than 8 or 9 pages, 10 pages maximum. And it's just because it's the kind of thing many people look at it and, you know, it has to be succinct and it has to have background information and it has to have references and links in it to, you know, current standards. But the supporting documentation, you know, things that go into the design history file, that can be many, many thousands of pages for a complicated device.
Okay, this is our last question. How does Stryker manage to stay in business?
You know, well, what they did was that part of Stryker is no longer in business. And it's, you know, as I mentioned, I used to work for Medtronic, and I was really, really proud to work at Medtronic. I worked for Medtronic Diabetes, and we sold the insulin pumps, and we sold those directly to patients. So I had a lot of direct patient contact because we were always juggling the clinician and the patient and the payer company and the insurance company. And Medtronic, though, has grown. I mean, Medtronic didn't invent insulin pumps. They bought a company called MiniMed, and, you know, turned it into Medtronic Diabetes. So all of these companies, I guess attorneys would know better than me, but when you have subsidiary companies, you know, you limit the liability. So Stryker Biotech was a subsidiary of Stryker Corporation, and, you know, the deal they made with the government was that, you know, they basically pled guilty. The fine they paid, the $15 million, was, I believe, more than the revenue that they took in for those products. So, you know, financially, it made more sense for them to settle with the government and just get out of that business, that type of business.
Okay, thanks for answering all of our questions. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts, TASA also offers e-discovery and document management solutions, free interactive webinars, and research reports on expert witnesses such as the Challenge History Report 2.0, the Professional Sanction Search, and the Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Christina Bernstein for her time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Ms. Bernstein, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. Thank you all again for attending and have a great day. This concludes our program for today.